At-home video games started as a box with a few knobs in your living room, to a box with a joystick, a button, and a few switches, to a box with a controller and some buttons, to a little box with buttons on it, to a bunch of big boxes with controllers and more buttons and joysticks, to a box with a magical controller, to another little box that hurts your eyes, to a little box that goes in a box that puts a picture on a big box, to a box that goes in your face, this being virtual reality, the obvious next step in the world of video games. Even if you're certain that you'll be at the front of the line for the release of the PlayStation 13 in 20 years, you better believe that the PlayStation will be attached to your eyeballs, because it's not going to be on your flat screen TV. And if that's the path of video games, you can believe that movies are headed in the same direction. Even though we haven't seen the change happen yet, VR headsets are becoming more and more common in households every single year, with the prices going down and the realism going up. And just like Elon Musk's Cybertruck, a VR headset will be a part of most family households in the next decade, whether you like it or not. But what I want to talk about today isn't specifically about the future of video games, but with music. We know where video games and movies are headed in our future, but not music. Music recordings were listened to in mono for decades before stereophonic sound became mainstream in the late 1950s. And since then, we've been listening to the same types of recordings. The equipment used to make music has evolved, allowing for better quality recordings and mixes, and the equipment used to listen to music has evolved, going from record players to radios to tape, all the way to smartphones and digital stereo systems. But what music is at its core, and the way music is consumed, has barely changed over a decade, and it's hard to even think of what might be possible. In the case of video games, consumption has drastically changed on every level, from manufacturing to consumption to actual physical gameplay. I mean, we've gone from simple games like Pong to games like Half-Life Alyx. But the same has not happened for music, because it doesn't really use as many senses, and it's hard to envision what else it could evolve into in the future, because so many people like it the way it is. But as a professional video game fan and daydreamer, there is one way I can see the future of music headed, and it starts with video games. But the game that inspired me to talk about this isn't a super futuristic game with robots, guns, and virtual reality glasses. It's a very simple game with a goose. Untitled Goose Game isn't a pioneer of any video game genre, and it knows that. The idea is simple. You're a goose completing tasks and causing trouble while doing so. It's nothing new, but its simplicity is what makes it so unique and eye-catching. The game caught the attention of video game fans everywhere, and in the span of 4 months, the small indie game racked up over 1 million copies bought all around the world. And as I was playing it, one thing caught my tiny little ears: the music. Untitled Goose Game is backed by a soundtrack of classical music, which is interesting in its own right, but the thing that really drew me in was how the music directly interacts with the gameplay. Sometimes when you get closer to a high-stakes situation, the music will pick up, and as you back away from it, the music will begin to slow down, even if it's in the middle of the composition. So let me give you an example and try not to make it too complicated. So we can hear the music speed up as the goose sneaks around the man to get to the ribbon, increasing the tension that the player feels. The music stops for a second, thinking that you might have succeeded, but then once the man turns around and catches you, the tense music picks up very quickly and the composition slows to an end as he takes it away from you. You realize the man's distracted, so you take the opportunity to retrieve another object from the pond, the bra. This time the same composition plays, but softer, to attribute to the feeling that you're sneaking around. The reason I bring this up is that instruments can't give the illusion of whether or not you're playing hard or soft just by raising and lowering the volume. Hitting a piano note hard gives a harder attack time and a rougher tone, while playing soft notes will ease into it, making the attack time longer so the tone feels easier to listen to. This is important because we know that for the game to give us 2 different instances of the same composition, it would have to be recorded 2 different ways, one for a calm scenario and one for an intense one. Listening back to that more aggressive version of the composition, we can hear that the intensity increases as the man gets closer to you. It's not constant. So hypothetically, depending on where you're positioned in that scenario, the composition may be different every single time you play the game. Of course, there's different ways that they could have gone about this. A simple one is if they recorded every composition digitally through MIDI and programmed it to play a specific way depending on the scenario in the game. Another way is if they recorded several live takes of the same composition and matched up the best recording that would fit with the current scenario. Or maybe I'm just looking way too far into this and they're just playing the same composition in every scenario in the game and I'm making it way too complicated. I definitely see this as the possibility with maybe the highest chance of being true, but I made this video anyways because I think the idea of what I'm hearing is a really interesting concept that I would love to see in more games. The whole concept seen in that 10-second clip is really subtle, but it immerses you in the game and the result makes it feel like there's someone playing piano with you as you're playing it. There are also several short compositions or chords that will be played on the piano quickly when running by a character or completing an objective, which feels like part of a bigger composition, but in reality, it's programmed the same way sound effects in video games are. These ideas implemented into the game aren't revolutionary or mind-blowing, but they're really smart and they're rarely utilized in video games. I mean, we've seen these ideas before, but I've just never seen them used in this way. The simplest iteration of it, as I said before, was sound effects. The same way you'd hear the sound of a punch in Street Fighter, you'd hear music played on cue as a character performs a specific action. Rhythm games like Guitar Hero are a really easy example of this, but once you leave the rhythm genre, it becomes a lot more impressive. An example that I can think of immediately in video games is when Mario has to run through a series of those rainbow musical notes and it plays up a series of notes in a scale or the same group of notes repeating. But even that doesn't have to do with the soundtrack itself, so it isn't something that stands out to me that much. One game soundtrack that does happen to impress me just as much, if not more than Untitled Goose Game, is Chibi-Robo. There's a great video by 8-Bit Music Theory talking about how impressive this soundtrack really is, but there's one really cool thing that the soundtrack does that reminds me of what Untitled Goose Game is doing. Every step that Chibi-Robo takes forms the notes of the melody that plays over the soundtrack playing in the background. These notes change depending on the surface you're running on, and the key changes depending on the time of day, so as you play the game you are literally playing the soundtrack and the melody totally relies on your gameplay. You get to choose the rhythm and the tempo without even realizing it. Musical ideas like this are way ahead of their time compared to what most games do today, and I think it's a really great indication of where video game soundtracks could go in the future. So now back to Untitled Goose Game. The game takes an old idea, gameplay-dependent music, and it simplifies it in a new and refreshing light. The game takes an old idea, puzzle and sandbox video games, and it simplifies it in a new and refreshing light. And with that parallel in mind, what genre of music is the Untitled Goose Game soundtrack? That's right, it's classical. The game takes the very old idea of classical music and uses a gameplay-dependent formula to make it feel new and refreshing, just like every other element of this game. Untitled Goose Game knows exactly what it is, and that's a new, simplified take on a lot of old things. The game might not be the reinvention of video games, but if you look closely, it could definitely point us in that direction. So my original question was, where will music go in the future? And I think that starts with video games before it moves to real life. Music in video games can be used as an immersion technique rather than just a background element by making compositions that are dependent on your gameplay like Chibi-Robo or Untitled Goose Game. Imagine a game like Celeste, but where the music changes depending on the impact of your jumps or the speed at which you move. How much more intense would RPG games be if the final note of some intense battle music hit at the exact time that Link killed the enemy in Breath of the Wild? If video games of the future were able to make predictions of gameplay and use the music to immerse the player as if they're a character in a movie, video games would be better on every level. I think that innovations with music should start here and could be a good way to change music along with the changes that gaming is making with VR. So that's my string of random thoughts about the future. I'm sure somebody else could write it out in a much more cohesive way, but for now, this is all I've got. Let me know in the comments what you think about this and if there's any other games like Untitled Goose Game and Chibi-Robo that I should try out. And thanks for watching this video. Subscribe if you want to watch a new one every single Monday. And of course, my recommendation for the week is Untitled Goose Game. I think it's really funny, laid back, and the soundtrack's very well done. And this week's Gamer of the Week is this link right here. Click it in my description to learn more. Thank you.